Legend has it that the Muskogee Indians used to race horses at Dry Valley in what is now northern Alabama. The natives referred to the region as Talatigi, or border town. Eventually, as American colonists began to settle the surrounding lands, the border of the Native American territory gradually began to shrink. By 1813, Talatigi had become a battleground as the Muskogee erupted in civil war. The Talatigi natives remained loyal to the Americans and helped General Andrew Jackson defeat the Red Sticks, an opposing faction who were fighting to preserve the sovereignty of the Indian Territory. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson would repay the favor by ordering the removal of all indigenous tribes from the southern United States. Disgraced by their compatriots and betrayed by their American allies, the Talatigi Indians abandoned their ancestral lands, never to return. According to legend, as the tribe gazed over Dry Valley for the final time, the shaman cursed the land and all of its future intruders to be struck with misfortune. 130 years later, the president of Nascar is looking for a new site to construct his most ambitious racetrack yet. After failing to secure a venue in Raleigh or Greenville, Bill France set his sights on a secluded valley in northern Alabama. The town of Talladega was chosen as the location of NASCAR's biggest superspeedway, where, rather than horses, men would race 2-ton hunks of metal at triple-digit speeds. Bill France probably never knew about the curse. Hardly anyone did. But soon enough, in one way or another, all of NASCAR would learn to fear Talladega.
It's not gonna work. Here we go again, boys.
I don't know. That was ugly.
Lead the Toyota. Contact! Bobby Labonte's over. It's the big wreck on the final lap.
New leader. Been waiting all day to say this. It's Ricky Bobby.
And it's shaking Big Ten.
How did he get through all these cars?
2/1000ths of a second.
Have you ever?
Oh, man.
The inaugural running of a NASCAR race can be something truly special. The first Daytona 500 in 1959 immediately cemented the race as NASCAR's most prestigious event. NASCAR's first race at Indianapolis in 1994 was such a spectacle that it attracted more entrants than any other event in the history of the sport. Talladega's inaugural race was also a spectacle, but not for the right reasons.
Hey, I'm Slapshoes, and this is an abridged version of my video on what is widely considered to be the worst NASCAR race in history, which was the very first race ever held at Talladega. If you want all the nitty-gritty details, the link to the full video is in the description. To say that Talladega's very first event was controversial would be a massive understatement. It was unlike any other race ever held in NASCAR history, and for all the wrong reasons. First, the track was completed dangerously close to opening weekend by design. Bill France had gone into serious debt trying to build this place, and he needs his money back as soon as possible. In August, just a month before race day, Talladega holds its very first tests. And despite topping out at 195 miles per hour, the drivers showed concern very early on. Donnie Allison, a multi-time winner in NASCAR's top division, said, "The track is as rough as a cob. It'd be a beautiful track if it were smooth. The only way they're going to fix it is to repave it." Meanwhile, Kel Yarbrough noticed that his tires were shredded after just a dozen laps on the track. He also noted lots of bumps in the turns, not exactly something you want to navigate when you're pushing 200 miles an hour in what passed for safety equipment back in the 1960s. NASCAR's two tire manufacturers, Goodyear and Firestone, take note of the tire wear and vow to come back with harder tires to compensate. The first open practice for all teams happens in September on the Wednesday just before the race on Sunday. And that tire issue is not resolved. Guys are noticing chunks of rubber coming off the tires after just a few laps. Goodyear and Firestone fly in harder compounds on Thursday and Friday, but nothing works. Drivers are getting uppity, and by Friday, Firestone backs out, citing safety concerns. The drivers, who just mere weeks ago formed the Professional Drivers Association, a union-like organization, are talking openly of a potential walkout. And the president of the PDA, Richard Petty, the winningest NASCAR driver in history, is in some tense negotiations with Bill France. But the straw that broke the camel's back was one exchange between France and Bobby Allison, who won the most recent race just last week. France says to Bobby, quote, "I think you're just afraid to race." Bobby was taken aback, but it was the quiet Leroy Yarbrough who stepped up from behind him and swung and hit Bill France in the face, knocking him to the ground. Leroy then calmly said to everybody watching, "Boys, pack up your stuff, we're leaving." And just like that, almost every single driver put their cars back on the hauler and left the track, save for 3 holdouts. One, Bobby Isaac, a soft-spoken man who never joined the PDA just because he didn't like the idea of anybody speaking on his behalf. 2, a non-PDA driver named Jim Vandiver driving a car owned by Ray Fox. And 3, a young up-and-comer named Richard Brickhouse. Richard made his very first NASCAR Top Division start ever just last year at Rockingham. And despite that being his first race on a paved track, he finished 4th. Brickhouse is a PDA driver and plans to walk, but the Dodge factory team pulls him aside and offers him a new ride, the brand new Dodge Charger Daytona, a winged supercar supposedly capable of speeds exceeding 200 miles an hour. But this weekend it won't happen. The tires just can't take it. Brickhouse agrees to the deal and turns scab, leaving the PDA that afternoon. So there it is, a 500-mile race at a 2.66-mile track with just 3 cars in the mix. Bill France offers fans a special deal. If you buy a ticket for the inaugural race at Talladega, you can use that stub to get into the Daytona 500 next year. With a 2-for-1 special that good, people turned out in droves to watch the shit show down in Alabama. But Big Bill has one more trick up his sleeve to make the race just a little less ridiculous. He poaches drivers from the preliminary race on Saturday, the Grand American Series, who race smaller pony cars on the infield road course, not the big track. Instead of Chargers, Chevelles, Torinos, and Roadrunners, they race Camaros, Mustangs, Darts, and even one AMC Javelin. These cars were never intended to drive on a track this big, and they can barely do 160 miles an hour with the wind at their backs. Not to mention, there's no way they could pass tech inspection. These are cars from a completely different series. So, Big Bill France calls an audible and just changes the minimum speed requirements and the inspection templates, all with just a simple wave of the hand. And just in case any driver is thinking of backing out, he offers cash bonuses just to roll off the grid on top of the already stated winnings purse. But with so much tension looming in the air over this slapdash ramshackle affair of a race, the stage is set for a disaster to occur, and it does, but not in the way anybody expected. That tire issue is resolved at the 11th hour when Goodyear flies in their last Hail Mary, and those tires finally held up. There wasn't a single tire failure that day. No, what did this race in was one of my favorite parts of old NASCAR racing, the scoring error. Electronic transponders and timing and scoring didn't exist yet, so officials would move placards around on a desk to keep track of all the cars. If the officials agreed on the running order, then it was final, but every once in a while they'd get it wrong. Well, that happened in this race. That's right, with only 3 cars even being competitive, NASCAR still lost track of Jim Vandiver and Richard Brickhouse, the 2 guys competing for the lead. Bobby Isaac was taking it easy, just worrying about finishing so he could have some easy points to make a run at the championship with all of his competition sitting at home. Richard Brickhouse is declared the winner by NASCAR officials, but Jim Vandiver and his car owner Ray Fox are adamant that they've won. And even the radio call with 2-time Cup Series champion Ned Jarrett in the booth thought Jim Vandiver was in the lead. And I think it's worth noting that Jim was driving the older model of Dodge Charger and was not affiliated with Chrysler Corp. Meanwhile, Brickhouse was driving the Dodge factory entry, and it was the first race ever for their new winged wonder car. Rumors persist that the scoring error was not an accident, and Chrysler executives sweet-talked Bill France into manipulating the finish of the race. After all, they kept some of the intrigue for the event by making a big deal about their new car. A lot of people in attendance bought a ticket just because they wanted to see that new Daytona rip around the track at nearly 200 miles an hour. Richard Brickhouse's win stands, and he is absolutely elated with his first career Cup Series win, and is so sure that he'll be tapped to drive the car full-time next year that he uses his winnings to buy a brand new airplane for himself. But unfortunately, he never got the call from Chrysler, or any team for that matter. In a year's time, he was semi-retired and only racing a few times per year. So there it was, a disaster of a race made up mostly of field fillers, a tire scandal resolved at the last possible second, a brand new supercar that nobody got to see the full potential of, and of those 2 competitive cars out there on the track, they were driven by 2 guys nobody had ever heard of, and we're not even sure which one of them actually won the race. If this isn't the worst race in NASCAR history, then I really don't know what would be.
So ends the tale of NASCAR's most disastrous inaugural race, and so begins the tale of the Talladega Curse. Over the next half-century, Talladega Superspeedway would play host to some of the strangest, unexplainable, and harrowing occurrences to ever afflict the sport of stock car racing. The earliest races at the track are possibly the most mysterious. They existed in a time before NASCAR was frequently televised, and most of the footage from this era is either missing or not publicly available. For many incidents during this time, only the stories remain, leaving the rest up to our imagination. The Talladega woes would continue in 1973, which may have been the most tumultuous single year in the history of the track. That year's Winston 500 earned the dubious distinction as the only race in NASCAR's modern era to start with a field of 60 cars, a decision that would immediately backfire on the 9th lap when one car blew an engine and spilled a trail of oil in front of the supersized field. Drivers were instantly sent spinning across the infield grass, kicking up a cloud of smoke and dust that made many wrecked cars impossible to see. When the dust settled, 23 drivers had piled into the wreckage, and the Talladega backstretch now resembled the set of a Mad Max film. Multiple drivers suffered severe injuries, including longtime driver Wendell Scott, who was so badly wounded that he was practically forced into retirement. It was an outright miracle that no one died that day. The following race at Talladega would not be so fortunate. Just 3 months later, teams and drivers would have to pick up the pieces and run it back in the Talladega 500. On lap 13, defending Rookie of the Year Larry Smith struck the turn 1 wall in a single-car incident. Hours later, fans and crew members were shocked to discover that Smith had tragically become Talladega's first fatality. Commentator Ken Squire was perplexed as the accident looked nowhere close to deadly. Smith's fatality was unbeknownst to competitor Bobby Isaac, who would go on to do something even more inexplicable later in the day. Midway through the race, the 1970 champion would impulsively pull his car into the pits. It was at that moment, in the middle of the race, that Bobby Isaac decided to retire from full-time racing. Media outlets at the time reported that Isaac heard a voice in his head which told him to stop racing immediately. After missing the rest of the 1973 season, Isaac would periodically return to the track for a handful of races per year. In 1977, the 45-year-old driver collapsed while exiting his race car and would be pronounced dead the next day from cardiac arrest. At the time, Isaac held the NASCAR record for the fastest lap at Talladega, which he set in 1970. In 1975, racing legend Mark Donohue ran a time trial lap at Talladega with an average speed of 221 miles per hour, setting a closed-circuit world record. Days later, Donohue was fatally wounded from a crash while practicing for the Austrian Grand Prix. On nearly the same day as Donohue's accident, beloved NASCAR driver Tiny Lund was struck and killed after another car collided with his driver's side door on the Talladega backstretch. In less than a decade of operation, Talladega Superspeedway had already been directly or indirectly linked to the deaths of 4 drivers. However, following the death of Tiny Lund, the Speedway spirits will look more kindly on the track's active competitors. To this day, Tiny Lund remains the last driver to lose his life in a NASCAR race at Talladega. While drivers would remarkably be spared on the track, there were never any guarantees inside of it. During the 1975 Winston 500, Richard Petty's car caught fire in the pits. As Petty's brother-in-law Randy Owens rushed to douse the flames with a fire hose, the nearby pressurized water tank exploded, launching Owens 15 feet in the air and killing him instantly. In 1977, veteran driver David Sisko was competing at Talladega when he was greeted by a terrible sight in the infield. His mother had been struck and killed by a pickup truck near the garage area. Sisko was apparently so devastated that he would never attempt another NASCAR race. Unbelievably, this wouldn't be the last pickup truck-related death at Talladega. In 1996, the president of ARCA was T-boned in the parking lot and would later go on to die from his injuries. Along with its string of inexplicable tragedy, the early days of Talladega also housed some of the most bizarre mysteries that stock car racing has ever known. On the morning of the 1974 Talladega 500, crew members awoke to an unnerving development. The race cars of nearly a dozen drivers had been sabotaged. Teams inspected their vehicles and discovered slashed tires, cut oil lines, and gas tanks filled with sand. The extent of the sabotage was only fully realized during the race, as many drivers began experiencing mechanical failures as soon as they hit the track. Miraculously, no drivers were injured in the fiasco, but sabotaging so many race cars at a track as fast as Talladega was practically attempted mass murder. Authorities launched an immediate investigation to find the perpetrator, but were unable to identify even a single suspect. Whoever sabotaged the cars did not leave a trace of evidence, and to this day, the Talladega Tamperer remains at large. Following the worst vehicular sabotage in NASCAR history, The track amped up security for future events, and while they succeeded at keeping future delinquents out of the garage, they didn't think to check whether one could wind up behind the wheel. Prior to the 1982 Winston 500, a few drivers expressed confusion at an unfamiliar name on the entry list for the race. A man by the name of L.W. Wright had purchased a race car for $20,000, which he entered in that week's race at Talladega. Despite claiming to be a seasoned stock car racing veteran, no other driver had ever heard of him. However, in an age before detailed record keeping, it was somewhat plausible that a driver could have honed their skills in some middle-of-nowhere town. The mysterious driver managed to qualify for the race despite wrecking his car on just the second lap around the track. As the crew was repairing the car for race day, Wright seemed unable to answer basic questions that any driver should have known. Suspicion aside, Wright managed to line up for Sunday's race and take the green flag. Immediately, it was clear that the number 34 Chevrolet was dangerously off the pace. Wright was quickly lapped by the leaders and was ordered by NASCAR to retire from the race.
So L.W. Wright again given the black flag as he passes by us, and Wright has been ordered to the pit area.
After pulling into the pits, Wright got out of his car, slipped into the infield, and was never seen again. It turned out that L.W. Wright was an imposter and had conned investors out of nearly $50,000 so that he could race alongside NASCAR's biggest stars. To this day, the true identity of L.W. Wright remains unknown. His alias persists as one name in the NASCAR record books that may always be shrouded in mystery. After letting what was essentially an average Joe mess around in a sanctioned professional sporting event, NASCAR would tighten up their standards for who exactly was allowed on the track. However, while paying more scrutiny to the drivers in the race cars, there was one other car they forgot about.
Well, the pace car, we understand, has been stolen. The officials are not driving this thing, and somebody has actually gotten in the pace car and stole it.
At the 1986 Winston 500, 20-year-old Darren Crowder stole the pace car that had been left unoccupied on pit road. He completed a full circuit at over 100 miles per hour before the police set up a blockade and took him into custody. During the whole bewildering spectacle, the crowd of 133,000 fans cheered wildly. Growing up, we're all told to respect the law of the land, but sometimes you just gotta root for the rebel. After the Muskogee Indians were forced to vacate their lands, most obeyed the order and subjected themselves to the infamous Trail of Tears. Some of the natives, however, refused to go west to the Indian Territory and instead chose to keep their destiny in their own hands. A few Muskogee turned their sights instead towards the south, in the mostly uninhabited territory of Florida. The subtropical peninsula had become known as a safe haven for refugees of the expanding American empire. Together with various other displaced natives and escaped African slaves, the remnants of the Muskogee would integrate into a new tribe, the Seminole. Although they too were forced to abandon their way of life like all the others, at the very least, for the time being, they were free. In 1819, Spain ceded the Florida Territory to the United States, and concerns of relocation immediately returned. Although the Seminole briefly received a reservation on the peninsula, it wouldn't be long until the federal government once again demanded they move out west. After already sacrificing so much, the Seminole refused to budge, and after Chief Osceola shot and killed federal agent Wiley Thompson, they found themselves at war with the might of the U.S. military. As the American troops marched into Florida, the Seminole warriors would soon be outnumbered by as much as 10-1. Needless to say, they were heavy underdogs.
Ballison is going to make a move. He's going to have to do it now. He cannot do it. Bill Parsons is going to win his first Winston Cup race. There's a checkered flag.
Talladega Superspeedway has always been unusually favorable to underdogs. The relative ease with which drivers can navigate the track opens the door for the occasional David to contend with NASCAR's Goliath. In addition to the fluke win of Richard Brickhouse in the inaugural race, 5 other drivers would score their one and only career victory in the first 20 years of competition at Talladega, by far the most of any track in the sport. In the early days of the track, winning at Talladega was a matter of endurance. Completing 500 miles at the longest circuit in the sport was a daunting task for even the most dominant race teams. Putting yourself in position to win was often as simple as overcoming the attrition of your competitors. Eventually, most teams figured out how to make their machines go the distance, and the name of the game shifted to speed. In spite of its many trials and tribulations, Talladega Superspeedway has always managed to draw in fans for one simple reason. There's no other place on Earth where you can witness so many cars go so fast. The track's 33-degree corners allow drivers to maintain incredible momentum throughout the circuit. Talladega may be the only track in all of racing where you can complete an entire lap without ever touching the brake pedal. The colossal oval is capable of producing such extreme speeds that most motorsports don't feel comfortable racing on it. In 1980, IndyCar had plans for a Talladega race. They would soon scrap the idea forever after it became clear that the cars would be moving so fast that any accident essentially meant certain death. Stock cars are considerably slower than open-wheel cars, but soon enough, they too would begin approaching the danger zone. Bobby Isaac managed to break the 200-mile-per-hour barrier as early as 1970, but rule changes to the cars brought speeds down to the 180s for most of the decade. Gradually, though, speeds began to creep back up, and in 1982, Benny Parsons would once again reach 200. Becoming the first NASCAR driver to eclipse the mark in a qualifying lap. 1 year later, Cale Yarborough would reach 202, surpassing Bobby Isaac's 13-year-old record. 1985 would mark the arrival of the fastest man in NASCAR history, Bill Elliott, who would qualify for the Winston 500 with a monster lap of 209 miles per hour. Elliott's car was so much faster than the competition that after a ruptured oil pump forced him into the pits, Elliott would overcome a 5-mile deficit under green to retake the lead by the end of the race. Even after burning several minutes on pit road, Elliott had just ran the fastest race in NASCAR history, completing 500 miles in just over 2 hours and 41 minutes. 2 years later, Bill Elliott would complete a 2 2/3 mile lap at Talladega in under 45 seconds, setting an average speed of 212.8 miles per hour. It was at this point that the entire sport of stock car racing would discover that they had ventured too far into unwelcome territory.
Talladega, it means speed, it means competition, and speed's certainly something we've seen a lot of this weekend, Larry.
8 drivers exceeded 210 miles per hour.
The identical front row as last year, Bill Elliott on the pole and Bobby Allison alongside.
Bobby Allison spent a brief period as NASCAR's most popular driver, and at Talladega, the Alabama-born racing legend was always a fan favorite. On May 3, 1987, Bobby Allison came inches away from becoming one with the fans.
One of the real threats.
Oh, we have a problem.
Allison is blowing a tire.
Bobby Allison with a horrible crash here on the front stretch. It has torn out a complete section of protective railing.
After a mechanical failure sent his car spinning down the tri-oval, Bobby Allison found himself at the center of the most frightening near-miss in NASCAR history. The Talladega pace had become so fast that even a slight aberration was enough to transform any of the 40 vehicles on track into a 2-ton projectile. Just as everyone was starting to forget about the Talladega Curse, the track would produce an incident so ominous that it would fundamentally alter the future of stock car racing. One may consider it benevolent of the Curse to spare everyone on that day, but the story of Talladega's most dangerous race doesn't end here. Following Bobby Allison's spine-chilling accident, the fastest field in NASCAR history would be conquered by the heir to the Allison throne, Davey Allison, who scored his first career victory on the same day that his father cheated death. 6 years later, fate would repay the favor.
A sad note in sports today. Stock car racer Davey Allison died this morning after the helicopter he was piloting crashed yesterday in the infield of the Talladega Speedway down in Alabama. Davey Allison, a great champion and a good friend of ours, was 32.
Although his life and career were cut tragically short, Davey Allison's legacy will always be etched in the 1987 Winston 500. possibly the most influential single race in NASCAR history. Bill Elliott would become the last NASCAR driver to ever reach the 212 mark. After this race, superspeedways entered the age of the restrictor plate, a new component to the intake manifold designed to limit horsepower and keep speeds under 200 miles per hour. This thin metal plate would completely change the game, and spawn a form of racing so sensationally unique that no other motorsport in the world even comes close to replicating it. Plate racing takes traditional racing technique and turns it on its head. It's a format that can allow the 30th place car to be within 2 seconds of the leader, featuring lap after lap of 3 wide traffic. Rather than raw driving ability, winning a restrictor plate race relies on the driver's patience, timing, and decision-making. Compared to the spectacular displays of speed in the past, Talladega racing would now resemble a high-velocity game of chess. Restrictor plates would usher in a new era of NASCAR, and along with it, a new era of mayhem.
Wow, that's not what you want to see out of your windshield. Oh my gosh.
While plate racing was intended to make the sport safer, superspeedways arguably became more treacherous than ever before. The frequency of wrecks skyrocketed as drivers now had far less margin for error in the close quarters traffic. With so many opportunities for calamity, the drivers would start discovering inconceivable methods to wreck a race car. Talladega had always been a place that pushed the limits of what was possible on a NASCAR track, and the early 90s saw a remarkable string of accidents where drivers would test the literal limits of the track. The 1993 Die Hard 500 was NASCAR's first race at Talladega after the death of Davey Allison. The event would be remembered most for 2 harrowing incidents. On lap 69, rookie driver Stanley Smith would suffer a head-on collision into the Turn 1 wall. The accident eerily occurred in the same part of the track as Larry Smith's fatal crash almost 20 years to the day after the tragedy. Stanley Smith would manage to survive, but with catastrophic injuries that would end his racing career entirely. However, despite involving a driver nearly losing his life, this accident is most well known for something that had not happened in a NASCAR race in a quarter century.
There is one car that has gone over the wall, as you see in that. I can't remember the last time we saw a car out of the speedway net. No, I can't either.
Jimmy Horton's number 32 Chevy had left the racetrack. The accident compelled NASCAR to install a catch fence in the Talladega corners. The new enclosure would come in handy just 3 years later, as it prevented Ricky Craven's car from also exiting the circuit in a similar crash. However, back in the 93 Die Hard 500, the mayhem was only half over. On lap 132, Neil Bonnett's car was sent tumbling into the tri-oval catch fence. Thankfully, after Bobby Allison's accident, NASCAR had strongly reinforced the line between the spectators and the action, narrowly escaping yet another tragedy. While it came very close, this Die Hard 500 did not live up to its moniker. The event would go on to be remembered as the race where cars seemingly refused to stay inside the track. The next time the Cup Series returned to Talladega, Mark Martin would discover the true meaning of going inside the track. Once again, NASCAR would have to make some modifications. Talladega has the strange ability to send cars in seemingly any direction. In a few cases, that direction would be up.
Is he going to win the Winston 500? They come through the tri-oval. Checkered is waving. Ernie Irvan wins and Rusty spins and gets airborne.
The blowover is one of the most ethereal moments that any racing fan can witness. We all know cars as some of the heaviest objects we interact with on a regular basis. Most of us would have to use all of our strength to get them to budge a single inch. And to think that something as light as air could be powerful enough to lift a 2-ton machine off the earth, well, you just have to see it to believe it. At the speeds NASCAR drivers travel at Talladega, it happens more often than you'd guess.
Well, Darrell, a 737 will, of course, it's designed to take off, but it will take off at, 160 some miles an hour. These cars are running 185, and the roof flaps do their job to keep that car from getting way up in the air. Wow.
Man.
In 1996, the Talladega Curse finally caught up to Bill Elliott, who suffered a broken leg after his car soared across the backstretch grass. But the most spectacular blowover in Talladega history belongs to a different Elliott.
Uh-oh, trouble! Elliott Sadler over once and a half and on his roof.
In 2003, Elliott Sadler would get over a full second of airtime as his car executed a near-flawless pirouette. The number 38 M&M's Ford must have covered the length of a football field without touching the ground. The following season, Sadler returned to Talladega and inexplicably became the only driver in history to blow over at the same track 2 years in a row, this time finishing the race in style.
He said he wanted to finish this race with all 4 tires on the ground. He did. But he just didn't keep them there the whole time.
It's one thing to watch a blowover as a spectator, but to experience one from inside a race car is a sensation most of us can only imagine. A NASCAR engine can roar as loud as 140 decibels, but in an airborne car, many drivers report a brief moment when everything falls silent. At the instant in which the mighty racing machine is briefly wrestled away from the dominion of gravity, it's as if the driver has entered the window to another realm. Do you think that if they listened hard enough, they would hear the faint thumping of horses galloping on the Alabama clay? Of course, in moments like these, most drivers have other things to worry about.
Oh, roll goes the 18! The 62 upside down!
Ever since Bobby Allison's accident, NASCAR has been continually trying to eliminate the blowover. But try as they might, Talladega has always found a way to send cars flying.
Oh, Logano gets turned! Logano is upside down!
While more blowovers happen at Talladega than anywhere else, the track's most iconic accidents are of a far different breed. Ever since restrictor plates introduced the age of pack racing, there's been a monster lurking in every superspeedway race. It's the reason why most drivers, teams, and owners dread Talladega Sunday.
Uh-oh, Kyle caught up the field. Accordion's back.
Whoa, man.
Trouble. Stewart in the wall.
Here we go. Here we go.
Robbie Gordon's in at the 33. Harvick is around.
Here we go, guys.
The big one.
They call it the Big One, a massive pileup that can wipe out more than a dozen cars in the blink of an eye. Talladega may have the most room of any NASCAR track, but when the Big One strikes, drivers often find themselves with nowhere to go. It can happen anywhere at any time. All it takes is for one driver to make one mistake. It's as simple as someone mistiming a block, sticking their nose in a gap too small, or inexplicably rejoining the pack at half speed. Whatever the cause, the outcome remains the same. Multiple drivers' days are ended by something they had no way of preventing. Modern-day NASCAR fields race with around 40 cars. Throughout the 90s, it was not uncommon for the Big One to involve 10 or more cars, about a quarter of the field. By the 2000s, the accidents started to become truly enormous. The 2002, 2003, and 2005 Talladega spring races each saw a pileup involving more than 20 drivers, with the 03 race consuming a Cup Series record 27 cars. However, the largest wreck in modern NASCAR history would happen at a Talladega race in what is now the NASCAR Xfinity Series. The division is essentially NASCAR's minor league, and in the 2002 Aaron's 312, inexperience would contribute to the mother of all pileups. On lap 14, Johnny Sauter's blue Chevy slid sideways and started tumbling in front of the entire field. Drivers began swerving into each other to avoid the carnage and quickly blocked the track. When it was all said and done, 31 cars were collected, nearly 3/4 of the entire field. Out of the few survivors, most would fall off the pace with mechanical issues. The race eventually boiled down to just 2 competitive cars, a scenario that may never occur in another NASCAR race. While Talladega races have increasingly turned into wreckfests, it's curious to consider that when it so desires, NASCAR's most feared track is capable of leaving everyone unscathed. The 1997 Winston 500 was the first race in Talladega history to run caution-free. After crashing into the infield just 3 years prior, Mark Martin would break Bill Elliott's record for the fastest NASCAR race, completing 500 miles in 2 hours and 39 minutes. In the following 5 seasons, 2 more Talladega races would run caution-free. As of now, it's the last track in NASCAR history to ever achieve this feat. It really makes you wonder, does Talladega create the mayhem, or do we?
We saw a lot of communication on that restart of that first initial start with the Stewart-Haas teams all working together to get in line on the front. You see them. They're pulling away, Jeff.
Let's show you how far this first group of Stewart-Haas Racing has driven away.
When everyone chooses to cooperate, we are capable of achieving remarkable things. In an ideal world, we could do anything caution-free. But there's a reason why idealism is so hopelessly fragile. While it takes everyone to avoid destruction, it only takes one to create it. As is the case with most things in America, the best you can do is survive.
What you got ain't nothing new. This country's hard on people. You can't stop what's coming.
How is it that when we find ourselves in the biggest place we've ever known, we still run out of room? Americans have always been infatuated with the concept of manifest destiny, the 19th century ideal that the United States should inevitably span from sea to shining sea. This grand vision of America was eventually realized at tremendous expense to those who originally roamed those lands. Even now, as we sit atop our New York skyscrapers and California mansions, manifest destiny is still very much alive. We apply it to what we wear, what we drive, how we conduct business. Enough is never enough. We are always marching forward to some glorious, indeterminate outcome. Why stop at building the biggest racetrack in the world when you can build one even bigger, steeper, wider, and faster? Our conquest for more never ends. Some call it greed, others call it destiny. The driver's strike at Talladega's inaugural contest gave many others a unique opportunity to race in the Cup Series. One of those newcomers was a 23-year-old Richard Childress, who would use the prize money from his big break to open up his own racing team. In 1981, Childress retired from racing and handed over the reins of his number 3 car to NASCAR's newest champion, a driver by the name of Dale Earnhardt. With Richard Childress racing, Earnhardt would go on to win 6 of his 7 Cup championships, and the Childress number 3 would become the most iconic stock car of the 20th century. Earnhardt's career will always be most intertwined with Daytona, but one of his most impressive feats was coming the closest of anyone to conquering Talladega. Despite hating restrictor plate racing more so than any other driver, Earnhardt was undeniably the best at it. He was so skilled at drafting that some competitors swore that he could literally see the air coming off the cars. In October 2000, Talladega would be the site of his final career victory. In possibly the most impressive display of racing mastery the sport had ever seen, Earnhardt would charge from 17th to 1st in the final laps to become a 10-time Talladega winner, by far the most of any driver. He may have won even more, but well, you know what tends to happen when someone comes close to conquering Talladega.
This is undoubtedly one of the toughest announcements that I've ever personally had to make. But after the accident in turn 4 at the end of the Daytona 500, we've lost Dale Earnhardt.
The white flag is up. Final lap at Talladega. Who's it going to be? Labonte, Earnhardt Jr., Stewart, or maybe somebody out of the pack? Look at this move by Jr. at the white flag.
After suffering such terrible loss, the Talladega spirits would shine favorably on Dale Earnhardt Jr., who would immediately carry on his father's legacy. 1 year after Dale Sr.'s final victory, Dale Jr. would score his first Talladega victory, one of 4 wins in a row at the track for the new Pied Piper of superspeedway racing. Dale Jr.'s remarkable success on NASCAR's biggest stage would make him an instant fan favorite. The newest racing superstar would carry both Talladega and the sport into its present-day incarnation.
Hey, Ricky, Bobby. Good to see you again.
Thanks, man.
You still owe me that $30.
Oh, no, man. You said that was a gift.
You're a dirty liar.
By now, Talladega had become so infamous in pop culture that someone was bound to make a movie about it. 2006 saw the release of the Will Ferrell comedy Talladega Nights, a film that features a winless driver growing resentful of his more successful teammate. Strangely enough, in NASCAR's first race at Talladega after the film's release, a near-identical storyline would play out in reality. Back in the 2006 Daytona 500, Brian Vickers is leading with just 15 laps to go and has a chance to score his first career victory in the biggest race of the year. Unfortunately for Brian, his teammate Jimmie Johnson passes him and goes on to win instead. 2 months later at the spring Talladega race, Vickers once again has an opportunity to get his first win.
Now, will Vickers be the good soldier and follow Jeff Gordon home, or does he want his first win that bad? He's got to get his first win.
He takes the lead with just 2 laps to go, only to get passed once again by Jimmie Johnson. Later in the year, the Hendrick teammates return to Talladega to find themselves nose to tail behind Dale Jr. in the closing laps. Both Johnson and Jr. are in a tight championship battle, and it's up to Vickers to help his teammate complete the pass for the win. What happened next wasn't exactly a shake and bake.
Jr. Oh, no! There's 25 up to 48 and takes out Earnhardt and Jimmie Johnson.
Talladega has always been known for its sensational finishes. Since 1980, about a third of all Talladega races have ended in a last lap pass. Such a scenario is portrayed to great effect in Talladega Nights, which makes use of the track's most distinct feature. While most tracks are designed with the finish line in the center of the front straightaway, Talladega's is about 1,000 feet farther down the track towards the entrance of Turn 1. While it may seem like a small alteration, this unique design aspect has affected the outcomes of countless races. It's amazing what can happen if you leave someone with just a little more room to run. The name Seminole can be traced back to the Spanish word cimarrón, or runaway. They were a tribe composed of wildly different people who all shared a single unifying vision, a refusal to be conquered. The Seminole warriors fought valiantly. They pushed the U.S. military to the most challenging and expensive conflict with any indigenous group in the nation's history. However, eventually, the Seminole losses had become catastrophic, and they simply couldn't outlast the overwhelming resources of the United States. One by one, the Seminole chiefs were captured and forced to surrender. By 1843, nearly the entire Seminole tribe were forcibly relocated to the Creek Reservation in Oklahoma. Only a small fraction managed to evade government capture by fleeing into the Everglades, a vast stretch of swampy wilderness considered by American settlers to be inhospitable. After nearly a decade of costly fighting, the military decided that further pursuit was no longer worth the trouble. By the end of the war, as few as 100 Seminoles remained, the last of the runaways. Throughout the rest of the 19th century, all of the other indigenous people in America would be forced to submit to government rule. Eventually, the Everglades Seminoles would remain as the last free tribe within U.S. territory. Despite all of their power and might, America could never conquer the Seminole people. There are some things in this world that you simply cannot control. Since its very first race, NASCAR has always struggled to control Talladega. The track has served as the ultimate fulcrum for the sport's greatest conflict of interest. By creating the world's most spectacular track, they simultaneously created the world's most dangerous track. NASCAR has always straddled the fine line between entertainment and safety. Throughout the history of the track, the sanctioning body has been in a constant balancing act in trying to prevent the next Talladega catastrophe while maintaining the track's unique appeal. The continual addition of rules and regulations has resulted in a style of racing that looks completely unrecognizable to the sport's humble beginnings.
And I mean, guys were slamming into one another, they're hitting each other in the corner. Eventually, just what happened is going to happen. It's going to happen again, too, probably before the day's over.
Many drivers today feel that Talladega racing is a glorified crapshoot, which is somewhat emblematic of modern NASCAR as a whole.
You know, look, these championships aren't like winning like Petty and Earnhardt used to win them. And, you know, it comes down to one race, and it came down to one race for us tonight and came up short.
How far are we willing to compromise the merit of competition to manufacture a more entertaining spectator product? NASCAR is always trying to tweak the sport to make races more exciting. But there comes a point where all the micromanagement becomes counterproductive.
It's idiotic to be out here doing this anyway, trying to put on some cute show for whatever the hell this is. It's stupid. There's no sense in doing this.
One of the most defining aspects of present-day Talladega has been the looming threat of controversy, where NASCAR's contrived bureaucracy ends up spoiling the race itself. In 2003, NASCAR would end its policy of allowing drivers to race back to the caution flag, as the practice was becoming too dangerous. Instead, the field would be frozen at the moment of caution, a change that would reach a breaking point the next spring at Talladega. When the caution came out with 5 laps to go, fans were thrilled as Dale Jr. appeared to make the pass for the lead. However, the lead was instead awarded to Jeff Gordon, as he was slightly ahead at the exact moment of caution. The race would not be restarted as Gordon would coast to a very unpopular win, as frustrated fans pelted the track with debris. NASCAR would later institute the green-white checker rule to minimize the chances of races ending under caution, a policy that has since undergone numerous confusing and inconsistent changes over the years. One of the most baffling officiating decisions for any NASCAR finish happened at the 2016 Xfinity Series race at Talladega. At first, it looked to be an amazing feel-good story with underdog driver Brendan Poole threading the needle to score his first NASCAR win. However, in an unprecedented reversal, NASCAR would award the victory instead to Elliott Sadler. The officials had bizarrely frozen the field less than 1,000 feet from the finish line, and in that instant, Sadler's car was briefly in the lead, despite being in the process of crashing. To this day, Brendan Poole is still searching for his first win.
And by that much, Elliott Sadler, a winner over Brendan Poole at Talladega.
Not even NASCAR's biggest stars can avoid the jinx of Talladega controversy.
Dale Earnhardt Jr. looking for his 5th win at Talladega.
Later in the 04 season, Dale Jr. would avenge his dubious runner-up finish by winning the fall Talladega race, only to once again wind up at odds with the sanctioning body. In his Victory Lane interview, Jr. would drop an expletive on live TV.
What does it mean to win here, not only once, but to win here 5 times?
Well, it don't mean shit right now. Daddy's done won here 10 times, so...
A mistake that would normally be a non-issue, but it just so happened that this was the year of Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction at the Super Bowl, and networks at the time were hyper-vigilant at maintaining their standards and practices. As a result, Jr. would be docked 25 driver points, which knocked him out of the championship lead. 2004 was the best season of Jr.'s career, and he may very well have won the title if all of us weren't so sensitive over a 4-letter word.
So the chase for the championship is over, and here's how it ended up.
2004 also marked the beginning of NASCAR's chase for the Cup, which eventually morphed into what we now know as the controversial NASCAR playoffs. The 2014-16 incarnation of the playoffs was very likely the most busted and unfair championship format in the history of motorsports. In October 2015, the system would be painfully exposed at where else but Talladega. This era decided to make Talladega a cutoff race for the next round, meaning that some drivers would be forced to do whatever they could to avoid elimination. On the final restart, Kevin Harvick has a serious mechanical issue. He can barely keep up at pace car speed and is practically guaranteed to get eliminated unless he does something dire. So, with no other conceivable way to save his season, Harvick swerves into the car beside him and causes a 10-car pileup. The caution comes out, Harvick coasts to the finish line and advances to the next round in quite possibly the worst NASCAR finish in the past decade.
You can hardly blame a guy for doing it. He's either going to make it if he does that and wreck some people going slow, or he's not going to make it if it goes green for 2 laps. But I don't know. It just feels like we kind of lost control on the situation.
You know, look, these championships aren't like winning like Petty and Earnhardt used to win them.
Modern-day NASCAR is always throwing curveballs, and drivers will adapt to do whatever gets them closer to winning. One of the most peculiar changes in superspeedway strategy was the brief rise of tandem drafting. Following the release of NASCAR's Car of Tomorrow, drivers began to realize that the flat-nosed design allowed the cars to lock bumpers at tracks like Talladega and gain an extra boost in speed. The tandem era would truly begin at the 2010 Aaron's 499, a race that saw a record 88 lead changes. By the next season, drivers had mastered the tandem, leading to one of the most unbelievable finishes of all time.
He's got room. They're 3 wide. 3 by 3 to the line. Johnson. Maybe Jimmy Johnson.
In a mad dash to the finish line with 8 cars under a blanket, Jimmy Johnson would edge out the win by 2 1/1000ths of a second, tied for the closest finish in NASCAR history. However, during its brief stint, tandem drafting represented too extreme of a departure from what audiences were used to, and NASCAR would eliminate the strategy in the following season. While tandem drafting was relatively unpopular in its time, many fans today look back on the era fondly. What has never been viewed fondly is the single most despised policy that NASCAR has ever implemented, the yellow line rule.
Kenny, I hate to deliver bad news, but they're telling me that they're going to drop you back to 21st for dropping under the yellow line. I went underneath Sterling, right? I was underneath him. He turned left. What the hell was I going to do? He run me in the yellow line. So I finished 5th today. I know that. So hell, whatever the hell they want to do.
The death of Dale Earnhardt convinced NASCAR to implement a variety of new safety measures. Most of these ended up being extremely beneficial, but one change, the yellow line rule, has plagued superspeedway races ever since. In an attempt to reduce the number of accidents, NASCAR started penalizing drivers for passing on the apron of the straightaways, which they now marked as out of bounds with a double yellow line. Despite their good intentions, this change was a prime example of NASCAR trying to outsmart the room by adding a needlessly complicated judgment call to what was a self-policing issue.
Here comes Junior, he's got to run. Kenseth tried to close him off. Left the line. It's going to be borderline, guys. It's going to be borderline.
Boy, I don't know. That was a pass under the line. I don't know what we're going to see here. It would be very unpopular to black flag him.
In 2003, Dale Jr. was not penalized on this pass for the win. 5 years later, Regan Smith would not be so fortunate after he was forced below the line while passing Tony Stewart for the win.
They are saying Tony Stewart has won the race. Tony Stewart is the official winner here at Talladega. They would not allow that pass below the yellow line.
That's what I was going with. I got forced down there, man. I had a nose inside of them, and I could have piled up the whole field, and I guess that would have been a cooler finish. I don't know, but I always got told that the rule is if you get forced down there, then you're the winner of the race.
Even as recently as last year, NASCAR still has seemingly no idea how to actually enforce the rule, as Denny Hamlin went way below the line on this pass for the win and wasn't penalized.
NASCAR has said the 11 is the winner.
Since its inception, countless great moments have been tainted by the perpetual asterisk which the yellow line rule creates. And the worst part is, there's no evidence to suggest that the rule has had any effect on its intended purpose of preventing accidents. If anything, the rule has contributed to an increase in accidents, as it effectively constricts more cars within a narrower space.
Yeah, I got a great idea for everybody. How about we just get rid of the yellow line rule? Nobody really wants to see the races come down to these type of decisions, and I don't think it's going to crash more cars than we crashed today.
Recent races at Talladega have been about as close as you can get to a demolition derby. It's not uncommon these days for a race to end with less than a dozen cars limping across the finish line. Over the past 2 decades, NASCAR has made incredible strides in safety, an unintended consequence of which was ushering in a new generation of drivers who no longer fear accidents. Back in the day, drivers were forced to use restraint on the track because the consequence of wrecking would be potentially inflicting serious injury on yourself or others. Today, drivers are mostly free to take unthinkable risks on track and walk away from any mayhem completely unharmed. Twice a year now, drivers start a race at Talladega knowing that they most likely won't make it to the finish.
Sorry we couldn't crash more cars today. We didn't fill the quota for today for Talladega and NASCAR. If we haven't crashed at least 50% of the field by the end of the race, we need to extend the race till we at least crash 50% of the cars.
This is Talladega, and this is the Talladega Curse. All the way back in 1969, we didn't just construct a racetrack. We constructed a monument to mankind's arrogance. We created something that we can never truly conquer, so that we can spend eternity chasing our endless desire for more. No matter how fast we follow them, all roads at Talladega eventually lead to destruction, misfortune, and controversy. The state of Alabama carries with it a hauntingly somber past. It has been the epicenter of some of the most unforgivable sins that we as a nation have ever committed. A history that's stained as red as the clay on which it all lies. And unlike clay, the mistakes of our past will never wash out. They follow us as painful echoes from a faraway time that's somehow still too close to us. We can never unhear them, but maybe if we get enough race cars together in one place, we can drown them out, even if it's just for a few hours at a time.
The writer, the Southern writer, William Faulkner once put it, "Between grief and nothing, I will take grief."
People always ask me why I watch NASCAR, why I enjoy something riddled with so many imperfections. And to that, I simply answer that we can design the perfect race car, but we can never design the perfect driver. Talladega may not be the greatest display of racing, but it is the greatest display of humanity. It's a racetrack where speed, skill, and machinery no longer matter. It's a venue that only seems to grow more prosperous through its legacy of disaster. It's a battleground where the mistakes of the few are destined to end the journeys of the many. The only place in all of racing that produces no winners, only survivors.
I think Kyle's trying to cross the start-finish line, don't you think?
Yeah, I believe he is.
He wants to finish.
He's going to do it.
There it is. All right.
You go this far, you don't want to be one lap short.
Every year on NASCAR's schedule, there are 2 dates that I never forget to tune in, when America's greatest drivers are confronted with the one track they fear most. In the land that America's native people once called home, 40 race cars are cursed to reenact their story.
That must be at least 30 cars in that wreck. God help all of them because there's no place to go.
The Seminole bided their time in the Everglades for more than 100 years. They emerged in an America that had grown rich off the lands they had claimed long ago. An America that was now looking to move on from its centuries-long conquest. In 1957, the Seminole tribe was granted federal recognition by the U.S. government, extending them special privileges as a sovereign jurisdiction. By the 1970s, the Seminole had begun using these privileges to host high-stakes bingo halls, which would go on to be the very first Indian casinos. While most of the Seminole tribe gradually integrated into modern society, a small part would continue their traditional way of life in the Everglades. This group would go on to form a new tribe, known as the Miccosukee. In 2002, the Miccosukee tribe was looking to advertise their new casino and turn to the world of NASCAR. 7 years later, the Miccosukee car would be the centerpiece of the most unbelievable moment in Talladega history. It's April 26, 2009. Americans are reeling from the struggles of the Great Recession, and on this Sunday afternoon, a few of them turn on the NASCAR Cup Series race at Talladega hoping to witness something incredible. In this race, they see big pileups, close racing, and bizarre oddities that only Talladega can seem to produce. With just 2 laps left, the audience sees something truly unprecedented. The 99 car of Carl Edwards rockets into the lead and starts pulling away from the pack. He's being pushed by a car no one has paid any mind to all day, the Miccosukee car, driven by rookie Brad Keselowski. After 7 years in the sport, the Miccosukee team has never won a Cup Series race. Their best opportunity to do so is now resting on the shoulders of a driver making just his 5th career start. Going into today, there's such long shots to win that odds makers didn't even bother listing them. However, with just 1 lap to go, the Miccosukee car has just one driver standing in its way of glory. The tandem are pursued by the Army and National Guard cars, but they're not going to catch him. Keselowski pushes Edwards to the home stretch. He looks high, then he looks low, as Edwards swerves down to block. Keselowski is forced all the way down to the double yellow line. He thinks about what happened to Regan Smith the year prior. He knows that if he goes below that line, it's game over. The Miccosukee car has been forced as far down as it can possibly run. It can go no further. It has been given no choice but to stand its ground.
Can Keselowski try to win it?
I don't think he can step out until he waits till the last.
Goes to the outside. Is Edwards going to no, he turns it. No, no.
Oh, and that destroyed the front end of Newman's car.
No.
Edwards will not make it to the flag.
Oh, Brad Keselowski won this race.
Carl Edwards' car destroyed.
Not sure where Carl's going. Maybe he thinks if he runs across the start-finish line, it'll count.
That's what he's doing.
I want to finish the race.
And he did,
yes,
to
he
a
did.
standing ovation from the crowd. Shades of Ricky Bobby.
The funny thing about NASCAR is that if you watch long enough, everything always comes full circle.